Hey everyone, CJ here. This time I'm going to do a bit of a crossover between history and literature and talk about the 2000 years evolution of the wuxia genre in China. Is wuxia just about kung fu fighting wire flying people in period costumes? Or is there something more to this genre? Let's discover the true essence of this genre by looking at its evolution through history. Most of the wuxia stuff people see on TV and in cinema nowadays are heavily influenced by the new school of wuxia writers from the 1950s, Liang Yusheng, Jin Yong, and Gu Long. Even though Liang Yusheng kicked off the new wave of wuxia literature, it was really Jin Yong who dominated the genre, and his many wuxia series are constantly being remade for TV every few years. I know that many of you who live in the West may have never heard of his work before, but I assure you, Jin Yong's wuxia series are humongously popular in the East and Southeast Asia. In fact, there is a massive hole in the wuxia literacy of Anglophone countries because hardly any of the works by these authors have been translated. Many of the wuxia movies that are available are really just spin-offs or just a slice of these epics. One of his most important series, Legend of the Condor Heroes, had only been recently translated, but there is still plenty more out there. Some people equated Jin Yong's importance to the wuxia genre to Tolkien's contribution to the fantasy genre. But the difference here is that Jin Yong was a word machine, and he pumped out series after series while running his newspaper company. Yeah, he was really just writing these wuxia series to sell his newspapers. But since he was such an erudite writer, many of his works became wuxia masterpieces. And he created so many wuxia series, once they have remade a crop of his series, they can just go back to the top and remake them all over again. The 18 Dragon Subduing Palms, the Sunflower Manual, he created a lot of wugong or martial arts styles and established a lot of the wuxia tropes we have today. But this focus on martial arts styles is really just a relatively new development. You know, it's sometimes become kinda hard to tell the difference between kung fu fiction and wuxia fiction because they both do martial arts and one of them just do it in an older period costume. Just to clarify, even though there are many overlapping elements, mainly the martial arts, these two genres actually have different main focus. Kung Fu focuses on the acquisition and the use of martial arts to tell the story. As for wuxia, this is what we are going to do a deep dive on. Wu means martial, things related to military and war, and xia is sometimes translated as hero, chivalry, or vigilante. But those words don't quite capture the full extent of xia. The use of the term wuxia only started relatively recently too. According to Professor Stephen Teo, it actually came from Japan from the early 20th century because before the Second Sino-Japanese War, there were plenty of Chinese writers and intellectuals who went to Japan to study. Before this type of fiction was actually called Xiayi fiction, heroic and righteous, which means that the martial part is not essential. Throughout history, the term xia have been connected with a lot of other concepts. There are Confucian xia, medicine xia, sword xia, bandit xia, female xia, monk xia, and the wandering xia, you xia, the OG of all xia. So the soul of wuxia and Xiayi narrative actually lies in this word, xia, and the first recorded connection between Wu and xia was made over 2,000 years ago by the Warring States legalist philosopher Han Feizi. So let's leave the new school of writers for a bit and go back to the start of the conception of the idea of xia and the developments of both the idea and genre through history. During the Warring States, before China was unified by Qin Shi Huang, there was a free market of ideas. Various philosophers from the 100 schools of thoughts competed for the attention of feudal lords, and among them was the legalist Han Feizi, who considered you xia to be among the 5 worms. The Confucians used their literary skills to disrupt the law, and the xia used their martial prowess to break it, he wrote. As the name suggests, the legalists are really big on sticking to the letter of the law. They have no use for Confucian benevolence and the you xia's heroism. Law is all you need. The historian Sima Qian, on the other hand, admired them and dedicated a separate entry for you xia in his history book. He thought that, even though the you xia of his time may not all walk the path of righteousness, he considered them to be true to their promise, and praised their selflessness. Historian Ban Gu criticized them for being insignificant commoners who have power over life and death. Yet, he still praised them for being warm-hearted and helpful to the poor. So the original Xia archetype was a complicated one. They are not the usual lawful good heroes. They are the type of heroes who uphold their own code of ethics above the law. It is still kinda lawful good, but it is for their own chosen law. That's why political assassins like Jin Ke, who tried to assassinate the tyrannical first emperor Qin Shi Huang, is often considered as a Xia too. Coincidentally, what is also considered to be the oldest Xiayi novel is actually Yan Danzi, a story which is based on the prince who ordered Qin Shi Huang's assassination. The Youxia mentioned in these history books are actually based on real historical figures, so there aren't any high-flying shenanigans in it yet. They are just rough and tumble blokes who commit violence for their ideals. The first depiction of the Youxia hero with fantastical power also came from a history book, albeit an unofficial one, the Spring-Autumn Annals of Wu Yue, and that Xia was a woman. Yue Nu, the sword instructor of Gou Jian's army. I covered her story in a much earlier episode. She fought an ape that transformed into an old man, defeated the king's soldiers, and even talked about the principle of swordplay with a style that followed the principles of yin-yang. Taoist cultivation have been part of the Chinese narrative tradition for even longer than this actually. Even in the writings of Zhuangzi and Liezi, Taoists believe that it is possible for normal humans to gain godlike ability and immortality, becoming Xian by various methods. From alchemy, this is called external alchemy, or by breathing exercise or meditation, which is known as internal alchemy. It is called internal because they mainly use the qi inside their own body to cultivate their power instead of external means like immortality pill. But through time, external alchemy became increasingly less popular as they discovered that ingesting mercury doesn't increase their lifespan, and neither did inventing gunpowder. So let's leave this cultivation talk for now. I will talk about it in more detail in a future episode. These Taoist cultivators are not necessarily Xia because they don't usually use their powers to uphold their brand of ethics and justice. Modern wuxia literature usually has some of these cultivation elements to justify giving their heroes fantastical powers. But the new school authors try to stay relatively more grounded. And if they were to crank up the fantasy and involve immortals and gods, then it would usually be categorized in the xianxia subgenre. This division between xianxia and wuxia is a modern phenomenon, because in the Xiayi fictions of the Tang Dynasty, there weren't any genre separation. Characters like the Kunlun slave, Mo Le, may also use magical Taoist powers, and the curly bearded warrior have Taoist connections too. In the Tang Dynasty, the Xiayi theme had become quite mainstream. Even the poet Li Bai wrote Xia-related poems. Another thing that became quite popular in China at the time was Buddhism. And since it had incorporated many Taoist ideas too, we start seeing heroes, or in this case, Xia Nu, trained by a Buddhist nun to become an assassin. Nie Yinyang. The Xia Nu had been part of the Xia narrative since 2000 years ago, so it kinda amuses me seeing Hollywood still trying to figure out strong female characters today. From the Song and Ming dynasty onwards, the genre kept developing, and along with the harmonization of Confucian, Buddhist, and Taoist philosophies, we started to see something that looked quite similar to the wuxia fiction today. As I've mentioned in the previous episode, even though the Taoist and Buddhist philosophies can be easily incorporated by the Confucian scholars, the religious side of Buddhism and Taoism were engaged in fierce religious bickering. They don't fight or start wars like the factions in wuxia novel, but they engage in propaganda war, reinterpreting the gods of other religion as their own. This is kind of a special feature for polytheism. They don't have to destroy their rival's religion, they can just absorb it. The legendary Taoist immortal Lü Dongbin is a subject of this religious tug-of-war. Before we have key blasts like the 18 dragon subduing palms, the first projectile attack trope was actually the flying sword, and the originator of this trope was Lü Dongbin in the story of Lü Dongbin slaying the yellow dragon with a flying sword. The title is actually very misleading, because in the story, he actually failed to kill the dragon, and the dragon turned out to be a Buddhist. By the end of the story, Lü Dongbin abandoned Taoism and became Buddhist instead. Obviously, this is Buddhist propaganda. Around the Ming Dynasty, the development of Xiayi fiction reached a milestone. This is where we start to see scenes of blow-by-blow fighting described in the narrative, and even Wukong martial art styles. Previously, the fight scenes were described quite vaguely. In the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, for example, they just described the duel between the generals as exchanging 10 blows or 20 blows. But in Water Margin, the fights have become very vividly described. Kick, punch, Wusong stepped on the tiger, pummeling it, and so on. I'm just paraphrasing here, but the fight in the novel is actually much more detailed. Water Margin is one of the 4 great classical Chinese novels, and it is a very important piece of literature in the development of what is to become the modern wuxia genre. Here we see very little supernatural elements. We have many heroes fighting for their own sense of justice and code of ethics. And at times, they can feel almost downright evil, judged by today's standard. Wusong avenged the death of his brother by disemboweling his sister-in-law. And later, he massacred the innocent family members of a magistrate who tried to assassinate him. This is kinda hard to stomach for people with modern sensibilities. Nevertheless, these deeply flawed characters still exhibit a form of Xiayi. They are categorized as Dao Xia or Bandit Xia, because even bandits have their own sense of righteousness. It is not a surprise that Water Margin is connected to the Yakuza culture in Japan. This novel became very popular there during the Edo period, around the same time as the rise of the Yakuza. The Yakuza is designated as a violent organization by the Japanese government, but they prefer to call their own group as Chivalrous Organization, Ningyo Dantai. If read in Mandarin, the first 2 kanji is Ren Xia, or Responsible Xia. Water Margin was just very influential in Japan. Besides the Yakuza, it also influenced Edo literature and, in a very roundabout way, also anime and whatever gacha hell you are playing right now. The Xia does not necessarily have to go against the law. In the Qin Dynasty novel, 3 Heroes and 5 Gallants, the main character was Judge Bo, which was based on a real historical person from Song Dynasty. This book is a crossover between the Xiayi and Gong'an, or court case genre. The judge in the story can't do martial arts, but he is usually assisted by martial artists when he needed to arrest criminals. Even so, he can still be considered a Xia character, because he will punish everyone according to the law, no matter how high their social standing was. Then, a very significant event happened in 1911. The Qing Dynasty was overthrown and the days of Imperial China ended. This also marked the start of the period of old-school wuxia fiction. From 1911 to 1949, the wuxia created in this period is closer to the classical Xiayi fiction. A very important author from this era is Huanzu Louzhu, who wrote the Legend of the Swordman of the Mountain of Shu series. Part of this series was adapted into a movie as Zhu Warriors from the Magic Mountain. This was also a time of innovation, as wuxia fiction started to be adapted into films. The Burning of the Red Lotus Temple and its 18-part series started the first wuxia movie craze. However, during this time, China was experiencing a severe case of cultural cringe, as it rejected Confucianism and everything that had to do with its own past. The nationalist Kuomintang government started to censor various work it considers to be unprogressive, and the bulk of the censored films were wuxia films. After the Kuomintang was defeated and went to Taiwan, this policy would be continued by the Communist Party for a while. But the production of wuxia films had already started to move from Shanghai to Hong Kong in the 30s, which at the time was still a British colony. This cultural cringe can also be felt down there, and rather than just continue making fantastical wuxia films, they started to make real kung fu films, featuring provincial folk heroes like Fang Siyu and Huang Feihong, doing what they claim to be real and practical kung fu. Huang Feihong is so popular, there are over 100 films featuring him to date. The new school of wuxia literature is a bit of a compromise between the more fantastical elements from the past and the so-called real kung fu. Gods and devils are not featured in the new school work, but they still have superhuman martial arts style. One distinct feature of the new school of wuxia fiction is the desire to be the #1 martial artist in the wuling. This desire to be #1 is actually very strongly influenced by the local kung fu culture of Hong Kong. There was quite a hubbub between the competing martial arts schools there, and readers just can't get enough of the news and gossips related to the rivalry of these schools. So, thinking that it would sell newspapers, Liang Yuseng, who was working at a newspaper company, was ordered to write a wuxia fiction column, and it became quite popular, heralding the age of the new school wuxia fiction. So Jin Yong, who was working at another newspaper company before he owned his own news company, was influenced to start writing too. Eventually, Gulong would also start writing his own wuxia series in Taiwan in the 60s. One very big difference between the new school and the old school wuxia is the foreign influences. Jin Yong's work was also influenced by classical Western literature and novels. It has melodrama, dilemmas, and so on. Gulong, on the other hand, went completely the opposite way. Instead of writing shelf-busting epics like Jin Yong, his works are shorter and episodic. He was influenced by Ian Fleming's James Bond and also Japanese mystery fiction. So, the rule of cool reigned supreme in his work. For example, when the character Chu Liuxiang from his novel was engaged in a mental combat with a veteran samurai, everyone thought that he would inevitably lose, because the moment he stopped pouring his wine, he would be distracted and leave an opening for an attack. But somehow, the samurai just couldn't find an opening. How is that possible? Apparently, Chu Liuxiang was using his qi to circulate the flow of the wine back into the bottle, creating an endless loop. Yeah, reading his work is just like reading a JoJo style wuxia. It is complete BS, but you just go along with it because it's cool. As technology progressed, wuxia became more fantastical again. The original Ki Blast actually came from Buddha's Palm series in the 60s. In the original Jin Yong novel, the 18 dragon subduing palm did not actually produce a Ki Blast, but many adaptations turned it into a blast just because it would look cooler on screen. As good as Jin Yong was, the biggest problem with him is that he was just too prolific. There aren't anyone after him who could compete with his work, and they could just get away with remaking his novels over and over again instead of making anything new. Nowadays, we have popular IPs such as The Untamed and Dou Luo Da Lu or Soul Land. But the Untamed really belong to the Danmei genre that focuses on boys' love, and the latter is an isekai literary RPG with wuxia coding. No, I'm not dishing these franchises. They serve their own niche. But the point is that period costume aesthetics and power cultivation do not make them xia. A xia is someone who struggles to hold a chosen code of ethics, often for the benefit of others. They can be doctors, judge, or even a monk. Martial arts is not essential, and vengeance is usually just an excuse to justify telling a violent story. I would say that one of the closest new franchise we have to wuxia right now is actually the John Wick series. Despite them not wearing any period costume, you don't need a Chinese setting to tell a xia story. In fact, you can even use superheroes to tell them. Actually, Batman is translated as Bat Xia in Chinese, and Spider-Man is Spider Xia depending on the region. In other regions, he is just Spider Person. Xiayi stories are important because it is a story about staying true to one's code and ideals, and how it can clash with other people's notion of justice. It requires great courage to do things that you believe is right, despite the opposition from the law or society. Consuming Chinese wuxia stories, especially Jin Yong's work, can be really worthwhile for you, because he explored and examined various aspects of Chinese history and culture. Nationalism, taboo, racism, Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, the thin line between good and evil, and more. Then, maybe after watching it, you can write your own Xiayi stories too, without having to rely on the period costume aesthetics and the cultivation trope. Anyway, if you like this kind of cool history/literature content, then be sure to subscribe to the channel because I'm going to talk about the history of ninja fiction next. Also, I would like to thank all our patrons on Patreon for supporting this channel. Until next time, stay cool, my bros!